So yeah, I mean, my whole career has been about adoption life cycles, and the kind of the customer success movement will be an adoption life cycle. What Dan referred to at the end was, for a long time, the Crossing the Chasm model, it's held up very well. But in the last decade, a second model emerged kind of out of the SaaS movement, where you could actually build up a market without appearing to cross the chasm. So that's where this two roads diverge thing comes from. I want to share with you two frameworks. One's the traditional chasm framework. I think it applies very much to a lot of the companies in the room who are doing B2B businesses. But a number of you are also doing B2C businesses, or maybe B2B2C businesses. And I think this second framework, the 4 gears, will be helpful there. And in both cases, the purpose of a framework is simply to give you a context for predicting the future, for saying, look, we're not there yet, but we have to have a framework for acting. And this two roads thing, I used to be an English professor, and so this is Mr. Frost doing a pretty familiar quote about two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And I want to give you a choice of roads here going forward, and at the end you can kind of think about which road maybe makes the most sense for the context you're in. So road number 1, crossing the chasm. So this model is actually 50 or 60 years old, and basically it makes one very simple claim that has proved out over and over and over again around the world. If you introduce a disruptive innovation into any community, the community will self-segregate into 5 different responses. And the responses are roughly proportional to 1, 2, and 3 sigma in a Gaussian distribution. So at the very front end, you'll get this innovator technology enthusiast response, which instinctively grasps for the new thing and is very entranced with it and wants to experiment with it, whether that's Google Glasses or our little watches or whatever. The next group are called the early adopters. They're visionaries. They're not particularly interested in the technology per se. They're interested in using the technology to change the competitive dynamic of their industry. So you might think of the first one as like Mark Andreessen, and the second one is Jeff Bezos. Right? So Bezos was not interested particularly in Mosaic. He was interested in completely redefining commerce. And so that's a visionary response. And then there's the two most common responses are the early adopters, who we ended up calling, the early majority, who we ended up calling the pragmatists, and the late majority, who we ended up calling the conservatives. And the pragmatists turned out to be the key vote, and they make their adoption decisions by essentially asking each other, are you doing this yet? And when they figure out that the herd's about to move, they move with the herd. Conservatives try to hold on longer. They try to say, look, I'd like to get more value out of what I had. I'm kind of nervous about the new stuff. And frankly, laggards believe that the entire room is an instrument of the devil. So basically, the thing that we learned in the early 90s was the first two groups spontaneously separate themselves from the community and go in advance. And they create something we call the early market. And there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm. In the Gartner model, they call this the hype cycle. It's the first part of the hype cycle. Sometimes we call it the time of the great happiness. And everybody's very enthusiastic. And then we ran into this problem called the chasm. And what the chasm was the pragmatist saying, I don't really think this is ready for prime time yet. Do you? And they'd look at each other and they kind of go, I don't know, no. Okay, me neither. Good. Okay, good. We're not going to do it. Right. Okay, good. But they would continually check in. So you'd always go to a lot of seminars and you get a lot of attention. You have a lot of meetings, but they never would actually commit. And the key learning was that we learned about any disruptive innovation is you actually have to start the fire twice. So you have to start it in the early market, then the chasm, it flickers, it may go out, whatever, in the chasm. You start it on the other side, and you start it in a slightly different way. You start it by tackling a very painful problem that a pragmatist says, look, I would normally not adopt your technology at this time, but if you tell me this technology can break the back of this problem, I'll put in with you. And so that's where the niche marketing came out of for Crossing the Chasm. Find that particularly painful problem so you could start the movement kind of on the other side. Once it got going, once you got 2 or 3 or 4 segments going, that's what the bowling pin model was about, you got this adoption thing going because people would come to a meeting like this and they'd say, you're not doing that. And they say, you are? Really? No, sure. You too? You too? You? Oh, Me too. Okay, so it was sort of, used to call it the junior high dance problem, where you'd have boys and girls on one side of the gym. I'm not going out there. You're not. I'm not. No, you go out. I'm not going out. And then at some future moment in the dance, everybody was on the dance floor. So same kind of phenomenon. And what it does is it creates these enormous spikes in tech markets where you get this incredibly rapid growth. And the financial markets to this day haven't quite internalized how that works. So the stocks gyrate all over the place. And if you miss a number, you go down like 35% in a day and that kind of stuff. But if you make numbers, they have these phenomenal valuations. Our friends in the leading SaaS companies right now, Salesforce, Workday, et cetera, have unbelievable valuations. That's still tornado stuff. But eventually you get to Main Street. And Main Street is when, okay, we've now adopted it, we've assimilated it, we're going to buy a boatload of this stuff going forward. The market is still growing very fast, but it's no longer kind of like an adoption decision. Now you're making purchase decisions. It's not a question of if, it's a question of which, right? And how often. Now the reason this the model became so important, and the reason why I think you want to keep it in mind in your own companies, is if your company is promoting a disruptive innovation as Gainsight is today. So customer success software today is not in the mainstream. It's not yet adopted. You're going to go through a series of 4 inflection points in your company's development, and you have to have a different strategy for each one. So the first inflection point you go through is the early market, where you're going to sell to the visionary. They're going to want to buy competitive advantage. They're going to want to buy it on a project basis. In other words, make me uniquely competitively advantaged. And all they're going to care about is a dramatic gap in performance. They will not be price sensitive. Okay? But what they're buying from you is a project, not a product. So whatever your normal product price is, multiply it by 10, because that's what you're going to end up having to put into this project, and that's what they want out. As soon as you have enough of these, in fact, I would argue if you had one great marquee customer in the early market, and Fortune magazine or some of the great the TechCrunch or so, all the blogs are writing about you, and you're getting the technology of your company is getting a lot of publicity, you've gotten a lot of the value from the early market already, and you can start thinking about crossing the chasm. Certainly after 2 or 3 of these, you're going to get to a point where either I'm going to be a project company for the rest of my life, or I've got to get off of this drug because I can't keep on having my engineering team working on only one customer problem. When you do that, when you cross the chasm, you now say, I'm going to look for a class of, it's still a niche market, but it's a niche market typically in a vertical industry, because it's typically a B2B model, where that particular industry has a problem that your technology is exquisitely appropriate for solving. And so you focus on that problem. And you focus on that niche, and you build a solution set. Now, there's still some tailoring for each customer, but for the first time, you're now having a repeatable template that you're bringing to a set of customers, talking about a problem that they totally resonate with, and you're bringing references of companies that are just like them, and they totally resonate with that. And so now, all of a sudden, you're getting this time where you're still focusing on performance. Can you solve the problem of breaking the back of this process? But now it's performance at a given price. These are pragmatic people. They're not going to like just open the bankroll, okay? So it's performance at a price. Now, if the market, and that's kind of it's a very interesting time to be in a company because it's very customer intimate, it's very interesting solutions. When the market moves on to a tornado, what's happened is people have said, you know what, this isn't industry specific anymore. This is just infrastructure. We just need this stuff, right? So in that model, it's all about taking the next step in productivity generically across a wide variety of segments. So now it's about the product itself, and we'll put whatever customization on top of it, but it's a kind of a land grab for the product itself, and it's all about price performance. And this is, in the tornado, it's all about vendors competing with other vendors. In a land grab, as all the pragmatist people rush out onto the dance floor, how many can you get into your install base versus how many does your competitor get into their install base? And it's kind of a one-time only land grab. And it sets up a pecking order in the marketplace. Who's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. So in relational databases, it was Oracle, Sybase, Informix, and relational technologies. Okay? So, and that pecking order is highly persistent going forward. So it's a very important time in the history of a company. But the people that are good at doing the tornado were not the people that were good that were doing the bowling alley. And the people that were good at doing it at the bowling alley were not the people that were good at doing the early market. And it goes one more time. So now once the thing becomes assimilated and there's no longer tornado growth, now it's more about the conservative value propositions. I want you to reduce costs. I want you to have a sort of a systems orientation. So now it's about price versus total cost of ownership. Every one of those four things is not like a new idea. But what's weird about tech is you may have to go through all four in a decade. And that's just, it's like swapping. I had a baseball team, and then I had to have a football team, and then I had to have a soccer team, and then I ended up with a basketball team. I mean, it can be that, it can feel that different. And so part of the excitement of being in tech, but part of the demand on a tech leader is you need to be able to recognize where we are and bring the team together around the appropriate icon. And there'll be genuine differences of opinion. People can say, we're in the chasm, the same room. Somebody can say, no, we're in the tornado. It's like, come on, people. So how do we pull this together? Because we're going to make a bet. At the end of the day, every year, your company should be making a bet on one of those four icons. And it should be a bet that everybody supports. Even if I disagree with the bet, it's incredibly important that we as a company make the same bet together, because that way, if we're right, we're going to knock it out of the park. And if we're wrong, we're going to learn very quickly. But when you have a team where some people think we're playing on one icon and some people think we're playing on another, and they don't support each other, then you have this horrible sort of spinning in the middle of space problem, which is what this whole framework was designed to stop. So strategy check workshops built around this framework has been the most sort of recurrent theme in my life for the last several decades, because once a company gets aligned on this stuff, they're very, very powerful going forward. So that's the technology adoption lifecycle, and it lives kind of at the front end of a much longer cycle, which is, well, how long will we have PCs? Well, PCs right now, they're certainly not an emerging market. They're not even a growth market, okay? They're probably most realistically a mature market. Some people might argue with the latest news from Dell and folks, there might be a declining market. Right? They probably have not yet become an end-of-life market. Right? End of life is sort of like the Kodak moment, but literally, I mean, there is no film cameras left to speak of, right? So, and technology, what happens is technologies at the left end of that diagram push to the right, and so they push the existing technologies right now. So right now, and when Dan was up here, he was saying SaaS is replacing licensed premise software. He said not only does Salesforce believe that, not only does NetSuite believe that, not only does Workday believe that, but Oracle believes that, and Microsoft believes that, and SAP believes that. Now, how fast? Probably another decade. Are there parts of the SAP Oracle suite that will not be replaced 15 to 20 years from now? I believe that. I believe that some of those foundations go so deep into the earth, they're immobile, right? You will never move them, right? But the point being, at the margin, if you look at where the marginal dollar is going to go in the future, it's clearly going to be going to SaaS. So when you look at this thing right now, and that's, by the way, what this catch the next wave thing's about. That's why Oracle did acquire Eloqua, right? That's why SAP did acquire SuccessFactors going forward, because they want to participate in that wave. So if you look at this model and you say, well, kind of where are we today? And so you say, well, OK, I think client-server apps, I don't think they've gone into D yet, but they're clearly needing to renew themselves. Cloud computing, I think, is now maybe still rising, but it feels like it's become just almost just like the most probable outcome. It's hard for me to imagine a board of directors approving a new data center for a company going forward. So it feels like it's pretty darn mainstream. SaaS applications, I think, are at the tail end of their hyper-growth period. I think we're going to, if you kind of look at the growth numbers for a lot of the companies, they're coming, just the fact that they're SaaS alone is not going to create the hyper-growth that it has created in the last 10 years. There may be hyper-growth within a subcategory of that. BYOD, I think, is kind of right now inside the tornado. It feels like every CIO I know is having some sort of BYOD, bring your own device response right now. Collaborative software, I think, is crossing the chasm. I think in some industries it's critical. I think in other industries they're not quite sure. and how open or closed should collaboration be, social software, stuff like that. I think Internet of Things is a classic example of something, it's the next $0 billion market, you know, for whatever number of years. But does anybody believe that it won't be huge? No, everybody believes it will be huge. The only question is, where are they? And so the question that would raise is, where is customer success software? Or for that matter, where is your company's software on this thing? And if you're from a large company, you may have offers in multiple places on this model, which poses significant challenges for how do you handle that front-end complexity of icons with a more performance-oriented, steady-as-she-goes, sort of Main Street sales and service capability. But in order to answer that kind of question, these are the things you do. And you can apply this to your own company's software. You can apply it to Gainsight software. Is there an installed incumbent in the category today? So I would say with customer success software, no. Okay, so that means it's not on Main Street. Okay? Is there an IT budget for it today? Inside the tornado, virtually every tech product gets an IT budget because people are buying so much of it. It's no longer a question of, as I said, of if, it's a question of when and who and what and how. And that's when you give the IT department the budget to go spend it wisely. If there's not and I would say today there's no IT budget for customer success software. By the way, I'm on the board of a company called Lithium, which is doing social marketing and social customer support. There's no IT budget for Lithium today either, okay? And I would say even Marketing Cloud, which is kind of, Salesforce, Buddy Media, and Radiant 6 and whatever, there's no IT budget for Marketing Cloud either. So they're not in the tornado for sure. Whereas I would argue Sales Cloud, CRM, yes. Well, so is it in the bowling alley? Well, if it's in the bowling alley, that would mean that a line of business or a department had a budget for it. And that's kind of what you guys are going to be fighting for, both as customers and as Gainsight-style vendors. We want to fight to get a line of business, probably a marketing line of business, budget for that today. But my bet is it's not there today. So if it's not there today, are you having lots of good meetings? That's the sign that you're in the chasm, right? It's when your sales guys come back and say, we had a great meeting, right? Any purchase orders? No, no. But it's a great meeting, great meeting. Lots of interest. These people really care. It's a little bit like the guy looking at it through the helmet and checking people out. Yeah, just keep talking because, yeah, right. Okay. So that's chasm time. It's a tough time. So if you're not there, then you're going to be in the early market. And in the early market, the question is, would it be highly differentiating to have this software? My bet is not really. I think this is a category that has to start in crossing the chasm and going into that niche market and figuring out which businesses have the greatest exposure to customer retention losses and it would be most ready to do this. So early on, I would argue that the telcos, the mobile telcos, had a huge issue around this stuff, but it was at such a massive level, I don't think they were solving it with the kind of tools we have today. But obviously, any SaaS vendor clearly is going to have this problem. And so the real question is, how quick can I wake up my company to the economics of this problem and to the disease called customer defection? Okay? And so I think it's a very curious thing when you're playing either side of the chasm. Because on the left side of the chasm, you say, look at all the wonderful things that could happen if you just invested in this software. And that inspires visionaries and enthusiasts. Pragmatists, it doesn't do anything for them. With pragmatists, it's all about, look at all the terrible things that will happen if you don't buy my software, okay? And so pragmatists tend to respond to pain, right? They have a huge to-do list as it is. They don't want to add anything new to it. The only thing that brings something higher on the to-do list is it's more painful. And the question is, how painful is lack of customer success in your business? That's the question. And so if you want the attention, if you want to get the resources to attack that problem, there has to be an owner of that problem. One of the things that's interesting about these new categories is they tend to create new job descriptions. So, I'm on the board of a company called Akamai. We do a bunch of things with content delivery. The VP of digital marketing, it's also important to Lithium as well, has become this new category. There wasn't a VP of digital marketing 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, but that's like the new line of business owner that's going to own the new budget. So if you have a card that says you are the customer success manager, director, whatever, VP, whatever it is, then that means there's an LOB, and it's your budget that's going to be the place that's going to fund this initial kind of conflagration of success for the customer success business. And creating that budget and creating that job title and creating that allocation and recognition that this is a core part of the business. And eventually it will become part of the performance matrix of the business, but right now it's still pretty novel. Okay. So that's sort of the traditional B2B thing, and it's looking at it primarily through the lines of a software vendor or a SaaS vendor who is selling to another business. But what happened in the last decade, and what caused me to sort of, I'm doing a complete revision of Crossing the Chasm with same book, all new examples from this century, but a couple of chapters at the end that are new, including this one, which is a bunch of companies came out and said, you know, and as students, because I spent a bunch of time at Stanford and Berkeley and these things, they kept saying, you know, so where was the chasm for Facebook? Where was the chasm for Google? Instagram? What chasm, right? Tumblr? Where's the chasm, dude? And after a while, I was like, well, you know, for a while I tried to fight back, and then after a while I thought, well, of course they're right, so maybe fighting back was not the best idea. So then we started saying, okay, well, so what's going on here? Because how is it possible that these disruptive innovations were coming in? So what was happening was the disruption, the internet had created a different playing field where you could introduce novel technology paradigms with virtually no technology inertial disruptive problems to overcome. You didn't have to bet as heavily. And so the model that came out of this was a model called 4 Gears. We went back, we said, well, what was Zappos doing? And what was, you know, what's Box trying to get done or Dropbox trying to get done? What's going on here? And you looked at it and you said, well, look, in this model, and many of you in this room may have this model of building your own businesses. In an internet-enabled world where basically you start with a customer actually already online and therefore already a click away from you, the first problem is acquisition, particularly in an incredibly noisy world of the internet. How could I just get people to come and even click on anything that related to me? If I could acquire them, how would I engage them? How could I get them to participate? How could I get them to come back? How could I get them to begin to buy in to whatever it is that my company delivers? So engagement has become an incredibly important word in strategy discussions over the last 5 years. The next thing you realize is, how could I enlist them? So that's what an NPS score is all about. An NPS score of 9 or 10 says you would strongly recommend to a friend to participate or buy into this vendor's offer. So now you've become an evangelist. So Dan was up here, and he already figured he had you engaged because you came, and they promised liquor at the end of the day. So I think he feels kind of like, they feel like they probably own you, right? Okay, so the question is really, can I enlist you during this day? And the difference between being engaged and enlisted is big. And it's probably about a 10 to 1 or maybe even a 20 to 1. Maybe, no, I think probably 20 to 1 is probably close, as opposed to 50. So, but somebody who's engaged is somebody who's a really good customer. Somebody who's enlisted has become a super fan. They write about you. They want to participate. They want to put stuff on your site. They want to be part of the movement. They want to have the T-shirt, you know, and they want to rattle that little noisemaker or whatever. Okay. So, and then the question at some point you say, well, but how do I monetize this thing? And monetization, as you're going to see in this model, it comes in later because what we learned in this model was, the way somebody summarized it once, they said, I finally figured out what URL stands for. It stands for ubiquity now, revenue later. Okay? and if you look at the acquisitions, it's true, right? I mean, it's true. So the monetization model can come in very late, and often the monetization will happen through the acquirer. So it will be Yahoo that will monetize Tumblr, not Tumblr that has to monetize Tumblr. But if you think about how this model plays out, here's kind of how it's going to play out. So the first thing is take monetization off the table. That's not where you start. You've got to get the other 3 gears going. And imagine that you are the entrepreneurial agent. You or your company. And what you're trying to do at the beginning of this thing is just see, can I get anybody to come? If I can get them to come, can I get them to engage? Can I get them to enlist? If they enlist, does that lower my cost of acquisition because they've referred them? Can I get the next group of people coming in engaged? Can I start spinning this up? At what point should I try to think about introducing monetization into the game? Maybe early. If you're a retail model like Zappos, it had to be early. You can't give away free shoes, but you're trying to get this thing going faster and faster and faster and faster and faster until there's a tornado. And so this is like spinning up a tornado, no chasms involved, right? It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's kind of magnificent. So in that model, you start to say, okay, well, 4 gears. We haven't found a 5th. By the way, the purpose of models is to be prescriptive. So if Dan said if you find the first customer success manager, send him a card. If you figure out there's a 5th gear, I need to know. Because right now I'm saying there's 4 and only 4. But in this model, there are 2 kinds of gears. The acquisition gear and the monetization gear are what we call performance gears. These are the things that investors look at first. They're the things that you tend to look at in an operating plan. How much traffic are we getting? How many uniques? That kind of stuff. Because the number of uniques is really monthly uniques, weekly uniques, whatever it is. How much total revenue? How much ARPU? ARPU is becoming kind of the critical phrase for this whole market. If you look at how Microsoft is redesigning its business, it's because they realize in this future world that Apple and Google have largely helped define, that the new economic model is you sell the device and you monetize the downstream revenue streams from that, the average revenue per user. And in Microsoft's old model, they didn't do that. They just sold a license and moved on, right? So you're watching people going, okay, I need to participate in this monetization thing. But this is the 2 things where you perform, you deliver money back to the corporation, you deliver users back to the corporation, and in doing so, you consume power. Meaning, how do you get permission to monetize? How do you get permission to acquire? Well, you get permission to monetize from engaging somebody. So you want to ask yourself, how engaged are our customers in our service, right? And you saw those little dials going up and down when in that bizarre sort of football glasses thing. But what we were doing was we were checking for how many click-throughs, how much are you really using the service, and if the more you're using the service, the more permission you will give the company to charge you money and to sell you more services, right? To upsell you. Okay? And in a freemium model, that becomes pretty critical, right? In enlistment, it's how many shares. It's like engagement might be likes and enlistment might be shares, but how much sharing, how much user-generated content, how much going beyond just the customer role, almost into the evangelist role. And the thing that will do is that will reduce the cost of acquisition. So engagement creates permission to monetize. That's why it's a power gear. And enlistment reduces the cost of acquisition, which makes it a power gear. Nobody can afford to pay for all the customers they acquire. It's too expensive. You have to, at some point, get a viral response. So all the thing about virality, that's about enlistment. And if you think about churn is de-enlistment, de-engagement, and then de-enlistment. And so when you're thinking about customer success movements, the power gears drive the performance gears. And the challenge you're going to have, and when Dan was talking about the big table and the little table, the big table is the performance table. And that other table that was really the supporting services is the power table. So that power is actually created outboard of performance. Now, after a while, performance becomes its own story, and the market starts saying, well, nobody ever got fired for buying number 1 kind of thing. But for a very long time, you're building the power through the engagement and enlistment thing, which means this customer success movement is right at the center of the power movement for this next generation of as a service anything, right? And right now we're doing infrastructure as a service and platform as a service and software as a service and now business processes as a service. But you can just see this thing is going to be as a service. I mean, where is it not going to be as a service? So everything from renting a car to having a place to stay. We're doing Airbnb and we're doing Zipcar and we're doing Lyft and and all this stuff. I mean, everywhere we're going, this as a service model is permeating society, and it's going to be driven by engagement and enlistment. Okay, And then it will be measured by acquisition and monetization. So you need all 4 gears. But I just want to draw your attention to the power gears. So that, remember I left you with the last one with the 4 icons saying how important it was to get your team to agree on which of those 4 icons, early market, Crossing the Chasm in the bowling alley, tornado, or Main Street. There's a version of this with 4 gears. And the 4 gears model says, look, prior to the tornado, at any given point in time, the hypothesis is one of the 4 gears is going slower than the other 3. And as a result, it's the gating gear in your success model. And if that, and this hypothesis is proving pretty darn interesting. I'm still saying hypothesis. I'm not completely convinced this is the only way to play the game. But here's how you play the game with this hypothesis. You work with a team to ask yourselves, what's our slowest gear? You focus everyone on speeding that gear up. You say, okay, in this, and I would say you do this 4 times a year. I would say, and I would do this on a 90-day basis. Okay, for the next 90 days, we're going to have an amazing initiative to speed up one of our 4 gears, whichever one it is. You still can't, you can't ignore the other 3 gears while you're doing this. This can't be linear. You have to do it in parallel, but one gear is privileged above the other 3. So at the margin, you're always thinking about that gear first, and you repeat that every quarter until a tornado happens or you run out of gas. So in this model, the question is, where's the slowest gear again for customer success? Again, this is a question that Gainsight needs to ask itself, but it's also a question that you guys need to ask yourself. So if you ask yourself right now, in fact, I'd love for you to think about your company. So right now, you say, look, if I could speed up 1 gear in my company, would it be to create the most value between, let's say, June, July, August, and September. So that's the focal point. How many people in this room would say, I'm just going to pick all the 4 gears. So pick one of the gears in your mind. I'm going to ask you this. I'm just going to do a quick straw poll. How many people would say, okay, for us, it's the acquisition gear? Just raise your hand if it's the acquisition gear. Wow, okay, a few people. Okay, acquisition gear could be, if you're early, it could easily be acquisition because you need to get people into the top of the funnel. Okay, how many people would say the engagement gear? Okay, it looks like a pretty good set of engagement gears. How many people would say, yeah, no, it's the monetization gear? We need to make more. So the deal is, which of these 2 models is going to make the most sense in your company? If you are largely saying, look, you know, at the end of the day, we're selling to 20 to 40 to 60 to 80 companies, it's the top model. Because you're going to sell them something that's going to be worth, you know, you're going to get annual contract values in the order of, you know, 50 to 100 to 200 to 500, whatever it is, that kind of stuff. It's a top-down approach. You use segment market development. You try to pick the market segment that's going to matter the most for you first. You target by industry. It's a direct sale to a target customer. You need to find that line of business buyer who can either has the budget or can go get the budget because of their role in the company. And you monetize early and often. Right from the beginning, the customer's paying up. The visionary pays up a big check. In the bowling alley, they're still paying up a lot of money. It's not a pay-as-you-go model. It may be a pay-as-you-go model, but there's big checks being written because you're putting a lot of non-recurring engineering into every solution. The biggest risk in this model, if you cross the chasm, is getting stuck in a niche. So one of the things you have to think about at some point in your history is, after we win our first niche, how do we keep the ball rolling instead of getting stuck? And that's that model. And that model's been going on for 30, 40 years in tech. And anytime you're selling from the sort of down the pyramid, that's the right model. But in the last 10 to 15 years, I would say really only in the last decade, there's this alternative approach to a tornado, which is to say, no, you start at the edge. You don't start at the center. You start at the edge, and you recruit a mass grassroots movement. So it's bottom up, not top down. And you need to start getting, the thing is, you need to get to hundreds of thousands and then millions. And in a media model, you need to get to tens of millions of uniques before you're really interesting. But one of the amazing things about the web is how fast that can happen. How fast that happened with Pinterest, how fast that happened with Instagram, how fast it happened with Facebook, et cetera. Okay? It's a land and expand market in the enterprise part of this thing. You can do a land and expand thing. You can come in one department and then spread out as you go along. It's viral adoption over the web, which means those enlisters become incredibly important to the model. You monetize late in the game. And you may be the monetizer, or it may be that your acquirer becomes the monetizer because they have an engine for monetizing you that you have not taken the time to build. So Tumblr Yahoo has a very elaborate fabric of advertising engine that it can now use Tumblr as a place to monetize. Tumblr didn't have to go through the effort of building it. They could get acquired by Yahoo to do that. And the biggest risk is never getting traction and getting lost in the noise. And increasingly, the noise is getting louder and louder. So it was easier to do the 4 gears, I would argue, 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's getting a bit harder. I think there may be some combo plays here, where you kind of do, at the top end, you're selling into a company, and initially you have kind of a crossing the chasm thing, but then you try to recruit the community. But if you look at how Yammer, if you compare Yammer to Jive, it's a really interesting example. So Jive is, Tony Zingale is the CEO. He comes out of the enterprise sales world. They've done a top-down, sell it to the IT out. Yammer, David came out of a more consumer products, consumer services world. They went from the bottom up. They were a grassroots thing, and once you got yammered enough, then they would sell the IT guy enough controls over the Yammer stuff. And Microsoft bought into that and has made it part of their world going forward. So use these frameworks in that way to sort of say, okay, which one of these is the one that's going to help our team the most? But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can actually work with both of them. And so what Frost has, this thing about 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I realized I came to the end of this talk, I thought I was going to say pick one of these roads, but I'm not so sure that you don't try to pick both, and I guess you have to become 2 people, so virtualization. All right, listen, that's all I wanted to share with you today. I want to thank you very much. I'm going to invite Dan back up to take the next part. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.